Welcome to another episode Beyond Perception. My name is Simon, and our guest today is Professor Timothy Owen Desmond. Welcome, Professor Desmond. It's a great joy, and I'm very curious what are the conversation will lead us to discover. And just a brief context to introduce you to our listeners. You are a professor of philosophy at the College of Southern Maryland and the author of the book Psyche and Singularity, Jungian Psychology and Holographic String Theory, which is also the basis for your online course called Immortality and the Unreality of Death, a hero's journey through philosophy, psychology, and physics. So, welcome, again.
Thanks. Yeah, I want to explain my name. TOD, Todd Desmond, is my initials. Timothy Owen Desmond. So my parents always called me Todd. So that's how I am known among friends and family, but on legal documents, I signed Timothy. So to clarify that. But yeah, thanks for having me. Eager to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, amazing. So I already mentioned some terms. So your work is uniquely positioned at the intersection of Jungian psychology and holographic string theory. And maybe as a start, can you share a bit about your personal experience, maybe an epiphany that led you down this distinctive path?
Oh, sure. Well, there were a lot of epiphanies along the way. My first epiphany came in 1989 when I went to Boston College as a freshman, and I was in the School of Management and doing horribly on the math tests for finite math for management. But it's a Jesuit school, so they make you take philosophy and theology for a year. And I was doing really well in this double class that was theology and philosophy. And I thought at first, it's just because this is easy and math is hard. But one of my friends who was acing the math tests couldn't figure out the philosophy. He was really upset one day. And then I realized, it's just different ways of thinking. So I switched my major. So that was the first, to philosophy and political science. And then I really got into it, studying Plato and Nietzsche were my two favorites. And then I discovered the Vedanta philosophy in my senior year. And then I noticed the extreme parallels between the Vedanta philosophy and Plato. They're practically identical. And then I read some theories about how Plato and Jesus both were aware of the Vedanta philosophy. And I know Nietzsche was. So it all was pointing me back to this, specifically the Gaudiya Vaishnava school of Vedanta, which is a theistic branch of Vedanta, focused on devotion to Krishna. And then I discovered all these theories about a connection between Krishna and Christ and Buddha as well. And so I spent 9 years living as a more or less of a monk. And then I went back to school to get degrees, because every time I tried to get published, if anyone bothered to respond in a personal letter, they would say, this is interesting, but you're never going to get published with academic material without a degree. So I said, okay, here we go. I didn't really want to do this. And then I went back to school and I got a degree at Georgetown in Masters of Liberal Studies, and at University of Hawaii, a political science degree in alternative futures for political design. And then finally a PhD in philosophy and religion with a concentration in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness from the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco. That was in 2014. And the big epiphany that happened there was I'd read Carl Jung's autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, for a class I was taking. And I read about his near-death experience. And I thought it was interesting, but it didn't stick out to me as anything more interesting than the rest of his psychology, which is so similar to Platonic philosophy, which is so similar to the Vedanta philosophy. But then on the 4th of July in 2010, I was working on a paper, and in the background, the TV was on, and it was Through the Wormhole with Morgan Freeman. And he was talking about the black hole war between Leonard Susskind and Stephen Hawking. And the way Leonard Susskind described his string theory of holographic information conservation on the event horizons of black holes and the outermost horizon of the universe, the cosmic horizon, was a perfect mirror symmetry with Carl Jung's near-death experience. Very, very precise. So precise that that was an epiphany right there. Because Carl Jung worked with Wolfgang Pauli, one of the co-founders of quantum mechanics, at the Copenhagen interpretation with Heisenberg and Niels Bohr. The three of them came up with the standard version of quantum mechanics. He got a Nobel Prize for that. And he approached Carl Jung from 1932 to 1958. They worked together on a theory that the laws of psychology and physics should mirror each other. They should parallel each other because mind and matter both emerge from the same source, which they had various names for, such as the unus mundus and the self archetype, the God archetype, and the one. It's equivalent to Plato's idea of the good, which is equivalent to God or Vishnu in the Vedanta philosophy. And so with that theory in my mind, which I was aware of before entering the CIIS, the school where I got the PhD, I learned about that theory in 2006 in Georgetown. But at any rate, here is what Carl Jung's near-death experience was. And then I'll tell you what Leonard Susskind. So Carl Jung in 1944. So Memories, Dreams, Reflections was published in 1962, a year after his death. And in that book, he describes a near-death experience he had in 1944, where he broke his foot and then had a heart attack. And then he said, I rose above my body, above the hospital in Switzerland. And he kept rising up until he was about 1,000 miles above the earth, he said. He later extrapolated from what he could see, the reddish sands of Arabia, and the part of the earth he could see. He figured out he was about 1,000 miles above the earth. And then he said he saw an enormous boulder, a black rock, hollowed out into a temple, like the temples he had seen on the Gulf of Bengal in India. And inside, he saw a black Hindu sitting in a lotus posture with a white robe in a brilliantly lit room behind him. And he said he felt as if the people he belonged to in reality were inside that room, and that if he could speak to them, he would learn all of the links of his previous incarnations and his future. And he said, my whole life was stripped away from me and then given back so that he lived his whole life simultaneously. And then an image of his doctor rose above the earth as if to summon him back. And Earth said, you can't leave yet. There's some project you need to complete. And then he woke up in his hospital bed. And then he had these ecstatic visions every night for 3 weeks around midnight, where he would go out to the horizon of the cosmos, where he said it seemed to him as if the past, the present, and the future are interwoven as a whole. And that each of us in the three-dimensional world lives in a little box of illusion, tethered to the horizon of the cosmos by a thread. So the past, the present, and the future are conserved at the outermost sphere of the universe, and they radiate in on these threads that connect each of us in our little three-dimensional cube of illusion. He said, that's what it seemed like to me. So he experienced that in 1944. He published it a year after his death. He instructed his people to publish it after he died. Then in the early 1990s, Leonard Susskind was in the black hole war with Stephen Hawking, because Stephen Hawking said, if information just means bits of energy and also the ability to trace their trajectory. So that it comes to this principle of information conservation. So Hawking said anything that goes into a black hole is erased from the universe. And Leonard Susskind realized that would violate the principle of the conservation of information. So for example, if you were to explode a bomb, not only must all of the energy and the mass still be in the universe, but the information that describes the trajectory of each atom of metal and gas should theoretically be able to be retraced to reassemble the bomb if you had a computer powerful enough to keep track of all that information. It should still be in the universe. But Hawking said, yeah, well, except for in a black hole, because anything that goes past the event horizon is gone forever. The energy gets compensated by what's known as Hawking radiation, which we can get into. It's kind of the next level. But the information that described what fell in is gone. So Leonard Susskind had a kind of a psychological crisis about this, because he couldn't see a flaw in Hawking's reasoning, but he realized if that's true, then the most fundamental principle of physics has been overturned, and with it, the whole field of physics falls apart. So Hawking seemed unconcerned with the implications, and Susskind wasn't, and he partnered with Gerard 't Hooft from the Netherlands, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, and together they came up with holographic string theory, which says that, yes, Hawking's correct, anything that falls past the event horizon of a black hole is erased from the universe from the perspective of someone following it past the event horizon. But simultaneously, from the perspective of someone outside the black hole, what they would see is that same bit of information, which they describe as the twists and turns of a fundamental string. So we can get into what are the strings of string theory, but to give this broad overview, from the outside of the black hole, you would see those vibrating strings slow down and smear out around the event horizon just before being absorbed into the black hole, whereas space-time is contracting toward the singularity faster than light. So nothing can escape that tidal flow of space-time past the event horizon. So they get smeared out just above the event horizon, and then they are released back into the universe with the outgoing Hawking radiation, like a letter carrier. That was his metaphor. And the Hawking radiation, we can talk about that in a moment, but Susskind said the universe is an inside-out black hole, expanding from a singularity at the Big Bang instead of contracting into one. And the cosmic horizon is an inside-out version of an event horizon. So his principle, called the holographic principle, says any information in any three-dimensional volume of space is simultaneously conserved at the two-dimensional surface area. That applies to a black hole and the universe as a whole, which means all of the three-dimensional information in the volume of the universe is simultaneously conserved at each point of this encompassing sphere, and that the past, the present, and the future are conserved on a kind of a two-dimensional holographic film at the horizon of the cosmos, and that information radiates back into the universe on the strings of energy that make up the cosmic microwave background radiation, the echo of the Big Bang. So these fundamental elastic threads of energy then radiate in and create the cubic illusion of three-dimensional space evolving over time. That's his theory with which he defeated Stephen Hawking. Stephen Hawking conceded. He said, okay, that makes sense. So he saved the principle of information conservation. But the reason it was an epiphany for me was how closely that paralleled Carl Jung's near-death experience. And Jung and Pauli had predicted psychology and physics will mirror each other. So here it was, general relativity and quantum mechanics don't work together, or at least they did not work together. There was this polar opposites of the field of physics, the theory of the very large, general relativity, the theory of the very small, quantum mechanics, but you can't use one of those languages of physics to describe the domain of the other. But there's only one universe, there should be one law of physics, so string theory unites those two. And when the field of physics became cohesive, then so did the mirror symmetry with Jungian Platonic psychology. It becomes very clear, it becomes very obvious, and the overarching pattern is this encompassing sphere of the universe, which radiates from a central point of infinite density, and the interior is an illusion projected from the cosmic horizon by threads. Carl Jung said that. Plato says that in his dialogues. The Vedanta cosmology says the same thing. They have Vishnu in the center of every bubble universe in the multiverse, and the outermost sphere they call the Akasha, the element which is often translated as ether. But the past, the present, and the future are interwoven there, and they radiate in on threads, sutrakman, soul threads. So I wrote the book, Psyche and Singularity, Jungian Psychology and Holographic String Theory. It was about this whole topic. And then the class that you mentioned, Immortality and the Unreality of Death, the hero's journey through philosophy, psychology, and physics, explains how this knowledge, when you see these parallels, which are so precise, it will eradicate rational doubt about the existence of the soul. That it is, you still require a leap of faith, but that leap, I say, is much easier to take once you've seen the evolution of physics, which brings us full circle back to Plato's original academic cosmology. So if you take this hero's journey, then you will, just studying these things is bending the mind. It's painful. It takes time and effort, but taking that time and effort is worth it because you can overcome the primordial fear of death, which was a focus of the class, immortality and the unreality of death. And we can talk about that too, but I'll take a breath and just have any comments for that.
First of all, thank you. Yeah, I'm very curiously listening. And so basically what I'm getting, and correct me if I'm wrong, is
sure.
What we are experiencing is a projection out of nothing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. A projection out of nothing. Well, here's another part of this. The cosmic horizon is there from one perspective, but from another perspective, it's not. If you were to physically approach it, it recedes with every step you take forward, it recedes. But when people have these out-of-body experiences, their body remains on Earth, but their psyche travels out there to the horizon of the cosmos. Susskind calls that cosmic complementarity. He's got black hole complementarity from one. If you follow a bit of information past the event horizon, it's erased from the universe. Neither you or that information can get back out. But if you watch it from outside, it gets smeared out around the event horizon and radiates back out with the Hawking radiation. And the reverse happens at the cosmic horizon. If you follow information past the horizon of the cosmos, the passage is a non-event to you. Nothing seems peculiar, but you can't get back into the observable universe because space-time is expanding faster than light. From our geocentric perspective, there's a horizon of the cosmos. But if you had a telescope powerful enough to watch somebody approach that horizon, you would see them get smeared out all over the inside of the sphere encompassing the universe, and then that information would radiate back in on strings of energy with the echo of the Big Bang. So from one perspective, the cosmic horizon is there, and from another perspective, it's not. So in that respect, yes, it's projected from nothing. From another perspective, the core of this, first I saw the near-death experience parallel with string theory. Then while writing the dissertation, I discovered Carl Jung's equation of psychic energy and mass. So that's the other part of this equation. So in 1952, February 29, I call it the Leap Day letter. He wrote a letter, and it was about the correlation of psychic energy and mass. So he was friends, well, not friends, but acquaintances with Einstein. He had dinner conversations with Einstein from, I think, 1909 to 1912. They were both living in Switzerland. And Einstein would speak to people in Carl Jung's field of psychiatry about physics and explain to them the basics of relativity theory. He was working on general relativity at the time. So Jung was aware, at least, of the basic equation, E equals mc squared. So if energy equals mass times the speed of light squared, and if the psyche has energy, then it should have measurable mass. Why can't we measure the mass of the soul? I remember Dan Brown, he wrote the book, The Da Vinci Code, which was very famous. And then he wrote another book, I forget the name of the book right off the top of my head, but it was about measuring the weight of the soul. So that was what Jung was thinking about. He says, maybe we can't weigh it because it's so infinitesimal. We don't have technology sensitive enough to weigh something that small. But then he reversed his thinking and he said, maybe we can't measure the psychic energy because it's infinite. And he went through all the different implications of special relativity. If you travel faster than light, then you're a principle called length contraction. Your length gets contracted to zero, and you're outside of space and time. So therefore, we can't measure something outside of space and time. And he ended the letter with an equation: psyche equals highest intensity in the smallest space. And he's talking about mass. So the highest intensity of mass is infinite, and the smallest space is zero. Just take each to their logical extreme. Infinity is the biggest, nothing is the smallest. That's the definition of a gravitational singularity. The highest intensity of mass in the smallest space is a gravitational singularity. Infinite density, zero volume. So psyche equals singularity. And that's a way you can translate Jung's equation. And it was written in the context of general relativity and special relativity. So it's perfectly natural to translate it that way. So when you combine that equation, psyche equals singularity, which is the source of space-time at the Big Bang, and it's the end of space-time inside every black hole, with Carl Jung's near-death experience of the cosmic horizon, where the past, present, and future are conserved, and they radiate in on strings of energy, there's where you have this point-for-point perfect parallel with current cosmology, culminating with holographic string theory. And it's ironic because Leonard Susskind, Stanford University physicist, presents the book as the antidote to the illusion of intelligent design. He talks about how all of the physical parameters that are required for life to exist are so perfectly fine-tuned, especially the cosmological constant, which describes the expansion rate of space-time. It's so precisely fine-tuned, a decimal point with 116 zeros and then a 1. If it wasn't exactly that, this cosmological expansion rate, then life wouldn't be able to form. So the implication is it's too astronomically unlikely to occur. There must have been some intelligent designer adjusting things so perfectly for life to exist. Leonard Susskind says, yes, it does seem like that if this was the only universe. But if we're just one bubble in an enormous ocean, potentially infinite ocean of bubble universes, then the infinitesimal chance that all of these physical parameters for life would be perfectly harmonized becomes inevitable. If you have an infinite number of different combinations of all of these parameters, it's inevitably going to occur. We just so happen to be in one of those universes where life can exist. So he presents himself as an atheist. I don't know if he really is or not. I've seen interviews where he kind of says, I don't know if there's a God or not. But in his books, he presents himself as an atheist. And so that's irony. I've got a maxim. So Friedrich Nietzsche, he wrote a lot of aphorisms and short, wise sayings. So I've got one, and I say, irony is the fingerprint of God. You know, up behind on a crime scene, if you look for the fingerprints, that extreme irony of Leonard Susskind presenting his string theory as the antidote to God. In my life now, since I've dedicated myself to this, that's the best evidence we have so far for the existence of God. The exact opposite, not even just slight, it's complete inversion of his intention, because it fulfills Jung and Pauli's prediction about these mirror symmetries between psychology and physics. So the singularity is kind of nothing because it's got zero extension in space. It's outside of space and time. It's not a physical thing, which is why Einstein rejected it. It was implied in his own theory of gravity. And when Karl Schwarzschild said, hey, look, Karl Schwarzschild was a German artillery officer in World War I, and he provided the first exact solutions to Einstein's field equations. Einstein gave approximate solutions. So I'm not a mathematician. I don't know what the math was, but I know that I've read the books written by experts for the non-experts. So in 1915, December 22nd, Schwarzschild came up with the exact solution to the field equations for gravity. And then in February 1916, he wrote another paper, which was the first description of a black hole. He says, look, according to your own theory, if there's enough mass condensed in a small enough space, and that density to size ratio is now called the Schwarzschild radius, that mass will collapse infinitely into a point of infinite density, which we now call singularity. And Einstein said he rejected it completely. He thought that was impossible. That implies something can travel not only faster than light, but infinitely fast. It's outside of space and time. So to his death, he rejected the possibility of singularities or black holes. And so do some other, major physicists like Michio Kaku. He rejects it also. So it's impossible. There's no such thing as infinity, he says. And he's also an atheist. If you're an atheist, I assume you've got a prejudice against the concept of infinity. I don't see, why can't there? It seems illogical not to believe infinity to me. But so to get back to your point, everything comes from nothing. Yes, from the respect of the horizon of the cosmos is there from one perspective. It's not there. It's nothing from another. And everything comes from the singularity, which is not a physical thing. So in that respect, everything comes from nothing. But I would call the singularity, rather than nothing, everything. Everything that ever was or will be condensed in a single mathematical point with infinite energy.
And that equals psyche.
Yes, that's
which
what
is a synonym for soul, or is there a differentiation?
I don't differentiate it.
Oh, okay.
Different people might have different definitions. It can, soul, spirit. You do need to define these terms, but Atman, for example, in Vedanta, the soul is called Atman. And then it's also called Brahman, which Erwin Schrödinger compared to the particle wave paradox of quantum mechanics. A soul is an individual particle of personal consciousness, Atman, and at the same time, it's an impersonal wave of potential being in the infinite ocean of potentiality, blissful, precognitive bliss, I've seen it defined as. So the singularity is Atman. It's also Brahman. It's the self archetype. Carl Jung called it the self archetype. Plato talked about the idea of the good, which is the source of all souls. It's the source of all archetypes. So I equate the singularity with all of those. It's the God archetype. God is the singularity. It's the infinitely powerful source of everything. It contains all information. That's just the math. And I'm saying, in addition, it has consciousness. It's the essence of consciousness. The physics doesn't say that, but the parallels between physics and psychology do imply that powerfully to me. And we're all participating in this omnipresent singularity. So you're a singularity and I'm a singularity, but there's one supreme singularity, which the Vedanta philosophers call Param Atma, or supreme topmost soul.
So we are the same singularity expressing individually.
Yeah, here's in the Gaudiya Vaishnava school of Vedanta, the phrase is Achintya Beda Beda Tattva. We're inconceivably, simultaneously one with and different from each other. And I think the physics of a singularity helps explain that. And I like the word inconceivable. You can't form a concept that would explain it. It's just a fundamental premise. I think another thing that's inconceivable is the particle wave nature of matter. Why should a particle be a particle when you observe it, a wave, mathematical wave function that becomes a wave of probability when you multiply it by itself when you're not observing it? Who knows why? That's just one of those fundamental things that you base worldviews on. It can't be explained why. It's the ground, it's the first principle upon which you can explain everything else. It itself has nothing deeper to explain why that is the case. So I don't know why it is, but I think we're all one, and simultaneously we all have our own unique individuality.
So would you say that implies there is no separation and everything is a mental projection?
Yeah. But at the same time, there is separation, but it is true to say everything is one in an immediate contact with everything else. And there's all kinds of physical principles that support that, like the principle of quantum entanglement. If each psyche is a singularity, and we all participate in the ultimate singularity, according to this principle of quantum entanglement, which Einstein, Rosen, and Podolsky came up with to try to disprove quantum mechanics. So Einstein didn't like quantum mechanics either, because it implies probabilities instead of a deterministic world. But what he pointed out was, look, according to the math of your own theory, it indicates that any two particles that were ever in connection with each other must remain in immediate contact, no matter how far apart in the universe they are separated, in such a way that if you spin one, the quantum spin state, it's not like spinning a top, but they use the word, I don't know what it means. But if you change one particle in one way, the partner particle that it was once in contact with will change in the opposite way simultaneously. And Einstein said that proves that this theory is wrong, because it implies one particle is sending a signal at an infinite speed to the other, but nothing can go faster than light. Therefore, because quantum mechanics makes this prediction of instantaneous connection, it must be wrong. But it was tested and proven most successfully by Alain Aspect in 1981 in the University of Paris South, and it's been tested many times since then. So quantum entanglement is an empirically observable fact. And given that principle of quantum entanglement, and then combine that with the Big Bang theory and the Psyche equals singularity equation, that means all of us were condensed in one singularity at the beginning of the universe. So we're in immediate contact. And I think some people, most everyone has had something like that. You think of a friend, and then the friend calls you, you haven't talked to the person in 10 years or something like that. Or you're humming a song, and then someone pulls up in a car, and the song that you're humming is, playing on the radio. Synchronicities and things like that, they imply some kind of an immediate non-physical connection. But I definitely believe we are all in immediate contact with everybody else. We are one. It's not like we're contacting. We never were separated. But there is the illusion of separation anyway.
Which then points to the difference between how things really are, reality, and how we perceive it to be.
Oh, yeah. Well, here's another interesting point. So Maya, that's the Vedic word for illusion. But in the Gaudiya Vaishnava school of Vedanta, there's two types of Maya. There's Maha Maya, which is the illusion of the material world, the temporal world. But then there's Yoga Maya, which is the eternal illusion of the eternal spiritual world. So then that brings up a question that I've asked before. What's the difference between an eternal illusion and an eternal truth? If there's an illusion that always was and always will be, how is that really different than an eternal truth? So personal interactions, they would say this is Yoga Maya. The personal interactions between the individual souls and the supreme soul. In the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, there's a spiritual world made of spiritual planets in Vaikuntha. That's their word for heaven. It means without anxiety. And on each planet, there's a Vishnu and a Lakshmi, the god and the goddess. There's one god, and he has a female side, Lakshmi, so Vishnu and Lakshmi. And there's a pair of Vishnu Lakshmi on each of these spiritual planets, Vaikuntha Lokas, like Radha Krishna are on one planet, Rama Sita, Sita Ram, they put the Lakshmi name first, are on another planet. So they all have a Vishnu Lakshmi pair, and there's an entire ecosystem of spiritual forms living on these spiritual planets. And each form is made of knowledge and bliss, eternal knowledge and bliss, and they have interactions. And our life on earth is a dream of those kinds of spiritual relationships. Those forms are Yoga Maya. They're personal, they interact, I'm me, you are you, we're different people, but their bodies are made of pure spiritual knowledge and bliss. And they engage in these interpersonal relationships. So that spiritual illusion is a higher level to achieve than the objective truth of impersonal Brahman, where there's no differentiation, but therefore also there's no personal relationships. You can't relate if there's nobody else to relate to. So they say, yes, Brahman is the absolute truth, is the undifferentiated, unitary ground of being. But it's got a material illusion on one side and an eternal spiritual illusion on the other. So I prefer to have a personal relationship with God. That's one of the themes in the Immortality and the Unreality of Death. I don't press that so much in the book, but I do point it out that these other traditions like St. Augustine in his Confessions, he also talks about the heaven of heaven is what he calls the cosmic horizon. It's where Plato said all the absolute ideas from which the temporary forms radiate exist. So that's a big, huge part of the classical tradition of philosophy. This everything is stored at the horizon of the cosmos, which I had read many times, but I didn't pay attention because I thought that's one of the outdated parts of that ancient cosmology, most of which I agree with, but this seems to be just not correct. And then comes string theory, and I'm like, oh, who was I to question this ancient belief that everything is stored at the outermost sphere? But at any rate, that differentiation between material and spiritual illusion is an important point, because it explains how it is you can have personal interactions, even though everybody is ultimately one.
It's basically a projection consisting of limitless relative truths or planes, and which are able to be experienced or
Right.
accessed depending on one's focus, one's intention, or
right. Well, then
what would you say?
Yeah, why is there even a material realm where we have these physical bodies? So in the spiritual planets, there's eternal spiritual forms. Each of us has our own unique form. You know, I might be eternally a goat. I don't know, anything, pine cone. So, but it doesn't matter because everything is fully God conscious and satisfied and blissful there. Like in a cartoon, everything's alive. But you mentioned all these. So here's one way that I describe how God unites the opposing principles of objectivity and subjectivity. So subjective opinion is my personal opinion, but then there's objective truths like 2 + 2 = 4. Math seems to be objectively true. It doesn't matter who you are, what culture you are. These are just objective truths. So I say God achieves objective truth by being each subjective point of view simultaneously. So he's seeing, or she, or however you want to describe God, but the supreme soul is you, is me, is every caterpillar and amoeba, and inside every electron and photon simultaneously. And each of those points of space-time has its own unique perspective, but God sees through each of those subjective points of view simultaneously, thereby achieving objective knowledge by taking subjectivity to its infinite extreme. And that's a big thing with Carl Jung. The supreme truth, which he calls the self archetype, he defines it as the ultimate archetype of oneness through the union of opposites, of wholeness through the union of opposites. That the primary tendency of the supreme archetype is it's the source of all pairs of opposites, and all the pairs of opposites tend to try to reunite with their opposing principle in this ultimate archetype, which I equate with the singularity, which includes its encompassing horizon. And those 2 points, the central point and the outermost horizon, if you are at the horizon of the cosmos, you would see yourself in the central point of the universe, and Earth would be at the horizon of the cosmos. So everybody, no matter where you are, once you're embodied in a physical form, you see the universe as if you're the central point and everything is expanding away from you. So the singularity I equate with the conscious side of the psyche, the ego, and the cosmic horizon I equate with the collective unconscious side of the psyche, where all of the archetypes are stored. But those are relative. It depends on where you are in the universe. It's there and it's not there, according to these cosmic complementarity principle that I talked about earlier. So yeah, opposing principles, and anyway.
So then, from your point of view, subjectivity supersedes objectivity?
From my point of view, it does. And that's just a personal taste. A Buddhist, for example, rejects the eternal reality of an individual anything. Like David Hume says, all you ever experience are discrete sense perceptions, individual sights, smells, sounds, tastes, and touches. Then your mind, through habit, organizes those unconnected sense impressions into enduring objective forms. But that's an illusion. That's what the Buddhists also say. And to release yourself from identifying with this temporary illusion of continuing forms is how you escape the cycle of reincarnation. And then achieve nirvana, which Buddha said he refrained from saying what it really is. But the implication is there's no eternal individual Atman. There's no eternal subjective point of view. I say, I believe there is. And so the class on the fear of death, a lot of it is focused on Ernest Becker's book, The Denial of Death. So in 1972, Ernest Becker published a book, and he died of cancer. This is the same year. He was 50 years old. And the whole book was about how the fundamental mainspring of human activity is the fear of death, trying to deny that we're going to die. But other animals, they don't have the fear of death. They're afraid to die, but they're not afraid of the principle of extinguishment of consciousness, whereas humans are. And that it's such an overpowering principle that the only thing that will satisfy us is if we can believe not only that we are eternal selves who will never die, but also that we're appreciated by an all-powerful observer, and an eternal, undying, all-powerful being observes us and appreciates what we're doing so that our lives are infinitely meaningful. He says, whether there's a God or not, and whether we are eternal or not, the human psyche needs to believe that we are. This was his theory, basing it on his analysis of psychology. After Freud, he says it brings us all back to Soren Kierkegaard's philosophy of you need to take this leap of faith that is the only thing that will satisfy the human imagination. We imagine we are eternal and infinitely important, and we need to satisfy that thirst. Now, the Buddhist philosophy says, no, that's the opposite. But I tend to agree with Becker. And then my point was, look, this Psyche equals Singularity equation, all these parallels between holographic string theory and Jungian Platonic Vedanta philosophy, they're so precise. It enables you to take that leap of faith in eternal subjectivity, and that we're all parts and parcels of a supreme soul. It makes that easier to do. And that even if it isn't true, if Becker's psychological analysis is correct, we'll be happier and more powerful if we believe that illusion that it's true.
And when you say leap of faith, is that a leap out of conceptual, rational understanding?
Yeah, I think you could say that, because I think conceptual thought has its limits. Earlier, I mentioned that phrase, achintya beta beta tattva. Achintya means inconceivable. It means this is beyond the realm that the human mind has the ability to form concepts about. Like I think Brahman is inconceivable. It's just a word signifying that which is inconceivable. Kind of like the word singularity. It's a point of infinite density that contains all space-time. That's kind of, to really think what that would experience would be like is beyond my powers of conception. But I do think you need to take a leap of faith. And then, so I talk about Blaise Pascal. Kierkegaard talked about a leap of faith, but so did Blaise Pascal, the theologian and mathematician, 17th century. He was a Catholic theologian in France. He talked about the wager, the famous Pascal's wager, about you have to make the wager whether or not God exists. If God doesn't exist and you bet everything that God does exist, you lose nothing. And the precondition for his thought experiment is that God is infinite, whereas anything we can achieve is finite. So no matter how big a finite thing is, if you compare it to infinity, it diminishes to nothing. Like you've seen those videos where they show our sun, and then the next bigger star, and then the next bigger star. And then each zooming out, ours becomes smaller by comparison until you can't see it anymore. So he was saying, God is infinite if there is a God. So if you're betting your finite life against the infinite possibility of eternal reward, it's betting something finite versus something infinite. So you've lost comparatively nothing. If you wager God does exist and you're right, you win everything. So why not make this wager? And Kierkegaard called it a leap of faith. And just before I get off that topic, the leap of faith, have you heard of the Munchausen trilemma? It's got other names, but it's an epistemological conundrum about proving a first principle of any argument.
Mm-hmm.
And it will always, any attempt to prove your fundamental premise will always end up going down one of three unacceptable avenues. And that's the trilemma. You know, Baron Munchausen, he pulled
mm-hmm.
himself up out of a mud pit by pulling his own hair.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He was on a horse and he just lifted himself out.
Mm-hmm.
So the first one is the infinite regress, which every child knows. You know, why does it rain? Because the water vapor attaches to the dust particle. Why does that happen? Because the sun, and it can go on forever. Why?
So it points to that we don't know, actually. We just assume stuff, no? Like a concept also is just assumptions about how things are, because we experientially don't know how things are.
Yeah, we can't
what would you say
prove
about that?
anything with reason. Well, okay, prove it to me. Infinite regress is one. The other one is circular reasoning.
Mm-hmm.
You know, why do you believe what it says in the book of Matthew? Because it's supported by the book of John. Well, why do you believe what it says in the book of John? Well, because it's supported by what it says in the book of Luke. Why do you believe that? Because Matthew supports, so that's a circle. So circular reasoning. And then finally, just claiming something to be self-evident. Why is that true? It just is. So you can never really use reason to prove anything ultimately. This is what Kierkegaard was saying. So at some point, you just have to stop your reasoning and take a leap of faith, because reason can never it can never achieve absolute knowledge. So if you want absolute knowledge, you could just say, then fine, then I'll just accept that. Everything's unknowable, and I'm okay with that. But Kierkegaard and Blaise Pascal and Ernest Becker, they're all saying, but really the human psyche is not okay with that. And the more of a sensitive person you are, the less okay with not knowing you will be. And I agree with that. And I can see how people can totally disagree with that. And I have no reasons to say you're wrong and I'm right. But if people feel like me, I'm trying to present theories that can really help take that leap of faith without having, but this seems crazy. I was like, look at the evidence and see which seems more reasonable. This is as far as reason can take us.
It's a bit like, like from my own experience, there are concepts which are closer to reality, and there are concepts which are have a little bit more distance to how things really are. And is this what you're referring to? Because in Zen, for example, it's like concepts or teachings are used like a thorn to get rid of the thorn, but at some point you have to throw that thorn away, because it's only to be realized. It's not something you ultimately can understand. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, you want to use all this. So in the class, I say we're combining two forms of yoga. We're not combining. It's two steps on the yogic ladder. Jnana yoga, which is, there's the yoga of, everyone knows, bending the body into certain shapes and holding them. These asanas, these geometrical configurations. Then there's also a form of yoga called Jnana yoga. It's the yoga of knowledge. And I see it as bending your subtle material mental body into different shapes, which is also painful. Yoga is painful. And so is philosophical speculation, to think these thoughts, to hold them in the mind and bend your mind to understand them. And then it's supposed to prepare your mind, according to some schools of Vedanta, for the final step of yoga called Bhakti yoga, which is the yoga means union with the absolute through a spirit of loving devotional service. So in the class, I'm saying I'm using jnana yoga, which is these philosophical, conceptual manipulations to prepare the mind to take the leap of faith required to engage in bhakti yoga. So Christianity is bhakti yoga, according to the definition of this individual soul surrenders itself in a spirit of love and service to the Supreme Soul. So for Zen, you're saying this is beyond verbal description, and I agree with that. But the verbal descriptions can help put you in a state of mind required to achieve this Zen-like state. In Vedanta, they call it samadhi. It's this psychological state of, Carl Jung would call it individuation, which is a state of psychic wholeness through the union of opposites. All of the opposing principles in your life. In the second half of life, you should start to, first, you differentiate yourself from everything. I'm not my body. I'm not the instincts that are propelling me to act. I'm not the society or its demands. I'm me. And then you re-embrace those opposing fields and harmonize them. So that's a state of individuation. And in my life, and for those who have a similar inclination, I'm saying a good way to achieve individuation or uniting with the Supreme Soul, who's the source of all opposites, is to just convince yourself that you're an eternal soul, that the material body is a temporary illusion, and that there's another realm. And I believe this evidence centered on the Psyche equals Singularity equation and this holographic string theory description of the cosmic horizon, it brings us full circle back to Plato and the Vedanta philosophers. And I'm saying that's not just a coincidence. There might be other reasons, like maybe language itself impels people to these concepts and that it's kind of predetermined just because of the laws of grammar, which is what Friedrich Nietzsche speculated about. He said Indian Greek, and German philosophy, they all follow the same orbit of concepts because of the grammatical structures of the Indo-European language. Like it's already written in the syntax of the language family, certain concepts will emerge inevitably. So it's not indicating truth, it's just mistaking the implications of grammar for reality. But you could have both. You could say, yeah, because the grammar reflects reality. So it just so happens that the laws of grammar are predisposed to reflect the reality of our oneness with the universe. I personally do believe in God. I've had a lot of synchronicities, meaningful coincidences. Like I really don't have moments of doubt about God's existence anymore. I might have some certain doubts about, particular details of theology, but the idea that I am a part of some supreme person, whoever that person is, at least I believe I've had enough interpersonal interactions with that supreme person that I'm convinced. And I believe that that person wants me to help other people come to the same firm relationship where it's not a matter of doubt anymore. You've overcome rational doubts, and now help your fellow souls do the same if you can. So that's what I'm trying to do. And that's why I appreciate you having me on here.
That's my joy, yeah.
Yeah, I get the feeling that you're I read, what you've written on your website. I know you're a spiritual seeker and you've dedicated yourself to spreading this kind of knowledge. So I'm sure you speak to a lot of people on the same wavelength.
Incredible, miraculous journey, the human journey.
Yeah.
And yeah, I personally, I'm just recognizing more and more that my understanding is very limited.
Sure.
Though there's better and worse understanding, and there's better and worse concepts and theories to kind of just to share that from a personal reflection. So what I came to realize, there's kind of fundamental principles or fundamental, maybe you would say, laws or which archetypes, which are a more sane orientation than just following my thoughts and my feelings and perceiving myself as or let me come back from another angle.
Yeah, sure. Well, these thoughts have a tendency to numb.
So what
numb
I
the mind.
Yeah, what I came to realize.
Socrates,
Oh, pardon.
Socrates said people call him a stingray because he has a flat face,
Yeah,
and because if you step on a stingray, you get stung and it numbs your foot.
yeah,
And when you engage with Socrates, it's like you got stung by a stingray. He numbs your mind. You thought you knew something, then you talk to flat-faced Socrates, and I don't know if I know anything. I think I might not know anything at all. I feel like that a lot too.
yeah, I
But I've
had
built
it.
up this tower of concepts that I'm
Yeah.
like, well, sure or not, it's a beautiful construct. It helps me believe in God, and I share it with others. But what do I know? I don't know the math behind any of these physical principles. I'm amazed by the square root of -1. That's as far as I got. I'm like, wow, that's an interesting concept. But yeah, yeah. How can you prove anything using reason? I don't think you can. But as you're saying, some concepts seem closer to the truth. There's a show on PBS, and I forget the guy who hosts its name, but at any rate, it's called Closer to the Truth. And he's an agnostic, and he interviews people. And he's like, I don't know what's right, but some things seem closer to the truth. I don't know what the absolute truth is, but just some things seem closer to whatever it is than other things. And that might be a subjective, I'm sure it's at least partially subjective, because some people might think just an atheistic worldview is closer to the truth. And then there's the opposite extreme where a personal relationship with an eternal God is closer to the truth. To me, the latter is the case. Maybe it's just how it energizes your psyche. But even the fact that a person will have an emotional, energetic reaction to certain worldviews implies some kind of underlying archetypes that trigger that energy. So where did that energy of conviction or repulsion come from? If you tell some people, I believe in God and the soul, they immediately get repulsed. You can see the energy of repulsion, and so there's some reason that that's repulsive to them, whereas others automatically are attracted to that idea, and vice versa. So, but given your affiliation with Zen meditation and this undergirding metaphysical reality, it would seem to me you think that a more of a spiritual worldview is closer to the truth than maybe
I bumped into Ramana Maharshi, who's an Indian teacher. I think he died something like 60, 70 years ago. And there are a couple of books about his teaching. And that book led me to recognize how limited my perception of myself is, and how that's just a relative experience, and that there's something undescribable beyond, and that led to an experience which basically changed everything, the whole context of who I am, and what I thought life is about, and also brought to eyes how limited my rational understanding is in reality, and also who I think I am. My identity is a construct, an imagination at its core. And I have it. I'm here. But it's a relative truth, a subjective experience, a subjective perception I'm experiencing, and there's a deeper absolute truth, which is like, I don't know how to describe it, but like, who's ultimately only to be realized. I
totally agree.
And that has been a bit my own journey. It was always chasing concepts and thinking, when I understand that, then I can get rid of my suffering. And that led me to chase concept after concept after concept. And at some point, it was like having a realization, and to see how this chasing for the ultimate concept was kind of looking down there in the corner while being here.
Be here now.
So what I find interesting is to explore concepts, because you could also say who we are as a concept. It's a construct. It's an imaginative identity we're experiencing. So it's at its core is an assumption of being here. We are experiencing. So without concepts there, nobody would be here to having an experience. I don't know if that makes any sense to you, but
Yeah,
that's
sure
something. I'm exploring for myself, yeah, and that's also this podcast journey is a journey through, you could say, concepts, perspectives, no, viewpoints. So it's always different. It always opens a different experience, a different window to reality, yeah, and
right.
it's
Concepts. Yeah, the concepts, I think, are the manifestations of these underlying archetypes of the collective unconscious. That's what Plato would say. He calls them the ideas, the eidos, imprinted on the soul, the absolute. Plato said everything you can experience in the material world is some dim, shadowy projection from some eternal form in the spiritual world. So we have these philosophical concepts, and I think they are emerging from these underlying absolute eternal forms of knowledge imprinted on the soul. That was Plato's theory. So when you are analyzing the individual philosophical concepts and how they interact with each other, each concept can bring you back to the soul and can bring you back to the supreme soul. And when you organize those concepts in certain shapes, I think it helps you focus in on the source of things better than others. That'd be closer to the truth. Some different, kind of chemical combinations of concepts create different overall worldviews, and some worldviews are better able to open you to this Zen-like enlightenment experience, which so many people have written about. William James has written about it. I mean, in the world of psychology, these peak experiences that people report. Psychedelic drugs can do it. Near-death experiences can do it. And organizing philosophical concepts in certain patterns, I think, can help us achieve these kinds of enlightenment moments. For me, synchronicities are a constant thing that keep me on the path, reaffirm my belief that I'm interacting with some supreme person. Because the fact that that there's some coincidence between my mind and my looking for meaning, and then I see some physical event, and it seems to be somehow symbolically related in a meaningful way to what I'm thinking in my mind, it implies there's some poetic force in the universe communicating, and that the medium of art for this force is the universe itself. The objects occurring spontaneously in space-time seem to be correlated to my own meaning-perceiving mind. And sometimes so precisely that it just really blows people's worldviews apart. Like St. Augustine wrote about a similar experience in the Garden of Milan. He was having existential anguish because he couldn't give up sex life. He wanted to be a Catholic priest, but he couldn't give up lust. He threw himself under a fig tree or an olive tree, I forget, it was this garden, and he wept bitterly. And then he heard a child saying, "Tolle lege," I believe that was the Latin, take and read, take and read. And he thought, is that some kind of a game children play where they say these words? He says, I've never heard that before. So he took it as God saying, pick up your book of scripture and open it up and read. And he opened it up. There's something St. Paul had written about putting away fornications and drinking and all that, and just put on the Lord Jesus and everything will be okay. So he said, then all my doubts flooded away from me, and then he became convinced. So there was a synchronicity right there, and that was a huge milestone in the history of Western civilization. Kind of was the birth of the Middle Ages. It was a fusion of the Catholic Church and Platonic philosophy via St. Augustine. And there's been so many kinds of synchronicities like that throughout history and in individual people's lives. I write a lot about it in the book because I focus on Carl Jung, and that was his theory that he developed with Wolfgang Pauli, the theory of psychic synchronicity. How do you explain these things? Almost everybody's experienced them. So that when I have experiences like that, that's not so much a concept as it's just a direct empirical observation. And when they occur, you have this numinous feeling like, oh, that was weird, and I take it as coming from God. So it makes me feel like, okay, God is observing, is aware of what I'm doing, does care enough to comment occasionally on what I'm doing. And that fills me with, I like the feeling that there's the infinite all person who is everybody taking a little time to communicate directly with me. That's how I interpret synchronicities. So that's not really a concept.
Would you say, maybe as a last question, that the concepts can be a great tool when used wisely and consciously, instead of being identified with the concept or stuck in a rational, more mechanical or mechanistic, logical self-understanding, and having synchronicities as a sign or as a indicator that one is in touch with life itself and not in an abstract, maybe conceptual perspective?
Yeah, definitely. As far as the concepts go, I believe words are inherently limited. We're using words. Concepts are just words strung together in a meaningful way, in a logical structure. And so Henri Bergson, who's writing at the beginning of the 20th century, he wrote about the difference between physics and metaphysics. And physics is looking at something from the outside, from relative positions, from above, below, left, and the right, and describing it with symbolic language. So if I hold up this remote control, it's like a black rectangle. So there's an infinite number of things that are black. There's an infinite number of rectangular objects. So words compare one thing to an infinite number of things that it isn't. It's similar to them, but it isn't. So words can never tell you what a thing is in itself, because what a thing is in itself can't be described by comparing it to things that it isn't. So words can never give you absolute truth. They don't have the ability to do that. And he says metaphysics is knowing something from within directly. And that experience can't be described with words, because words can only compare it to things that it isn't. But what he said was that symbolic language can put you in an attitude that makes it more conducive to having a direct intuition of something. And if psyche equals singularity, and considering this concept of quantum entanglement, we are one with everything. So we can have direct intuitive knowledge of everything because we are one with everything. But that absolute knowledge can never be adequately described with words, and therefore it can't be confined to conceptual forms. But some of those conceptual forms are more conducive to enabling you to experience the direct reality of the thing. Now, some different egos might be able to get there using different conceptual forms. Depending on your subjective point of view, maybe another philosophical construct would help you achieve the same direct intuition of the absolute truth. So I agree that, no string of words or mathematical symbols will ever reveal the absolute truth. But some of them, I think, are better able to help certain individuals achieve that level of metaphysical intuition.
And then one could also say that we could say the same words, but it would be differently received depending on our intention or our own worldview. You could say being transported through the words, so that there's like 10 people could share the same concept, but it could yield very different experiences or understanding.
Oh yeah, totally. And also 10 different people could explain the same concept, and it would have a different effect even on the same person who's listening, depending on who's describing it. I think somebody who's had a direct experience describing the concepts using the same exact words will come across as more authentic and more believable if they're just trying to use concepts to describe something that they know inwardly, and they're trying with the best ability they can to use this imperfect medium of language to describe this intuition that they've had. So I do agree with that. I know we've been pushing this. We've been doing it about an hour and 20 minutes. Is a normal class period in my community college.
Thank you, Professor Desmond, for taking the time and being here with us, and sharing from your experience and wisdom, and a very insightful conversation. So thank you very much. And
thanks, Simon. Thanks for having me.
For everybody who is listening and watching, we will link to your websites and to the course you mentioned earlier, so that everybody who is interested can learn more about what you do. And
all right, great.
That's that. Thank you very much again. Yeah. And
okay, maybe we'll have a talk again sometime.
Yeah, that would be amazing.
All right. Well.
So thank you again. Thank you again, and all the best, and see you next time.
Okay, great.